Okay, thank you all for joining us. Happy Ascension. It's May 25th, 2017, and this is our fifth C.O.M.E webinar. We're really pleased to have people attending from every metropolis and in Canada as well. And today we're going to be talking about parish leadership and organization with Father Evan Armatas. Father Evan is the Priest Dominos at St. Spyridon Greek Orthodox Church in Loveland, Colorado. He's also the host of the Orthodoxy live podcast on Ancient Faith Radio. And the reason we've invited Father Evan here today is because he gave an excellent presentation in October 2016 at the National Missions and Evangelism Conference about parish leadership and organization. And that spurred a lot of questions and a lot of excitement. And so we thought it's definitely time to do some follow-up and have a chance to ask Father Evan our questions directly. So today we're going to be reviewing only slightly a couple of the key points from that presentation, but then we're just going to jump into questions. So Father Evan, thank you so much for being here, and please open us with a prayer, then we can jump in.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O Christ our God, who ascended in glory from the midst of his disciples, to be seated on the right hand of the God, the Father on high, bless now our gathering together, illumine our hearts and minds to the true knowledge of you. In so doing, may we build up our parishes for the salvation of souls and the glory of your name. You are holy always now and never and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Well, it's a pleasure, Tomaida, to be with you, to work with you again. Thanks for the invitation. To all of you who are listening today, we hope the presentation is beneficial. As Tomaida mentioned, this is really a follow-up to our presentation in Portland. So many of the concepts that we talked about there, we're assuming you've looked at that presentation. If you haven't, you can of course listen to this one, but we would encourage you to go back and listen to the other one. I'm going to, as Tomaida asked me, give a very, very brief introduction to some of the concepts that we had in that opening presentation. And I just want to say from the outset, I'm not an expert. I noticed at least one parishioner from my parish who's on the webinar today, and he can attest to the fact that I'm a struggler, and that this whole process of learning admin, leadership, of helping your parish do the same, just that, it's a process, as I have in the slides from Portland. You can't eat a salami in one sitting, one slice at a time. And I've been very fortunate, I think, because of my own weaknesses and struggle as a parish leader, to basically have some great people around me who've taught me so much. I have to give a shout out to one parishioner in particular, Chris Christopher, who's helped me tremendously understanding these concepts and applying them. Well, as I get going here, you'll see that this first slide that Tomaida created is one that basically summarizes the point that I made during the presentation in Portland. God wants growth. He promises it in Holy Scripture. And our job really is to eliminate the obstacles that stand in the way. And so if we go to the next slide that she put together, it's kind of a summary. One of the things that I pointed out in the presentation, that there are some basic common obstacles. The first is we often are asking the wrong question. We often are asking ourselves, why are we not growing? I think you've got to eliminate that thinking completely, and you have to go to the second question, what stands in our way? I think if you go there as opposed to the other, you're not going to be chasing your tail or really chasing growth strategies, because inherently the church will grow. Preliminarily, there are some obstacles that we often find in our parishes. The soil hasn't been tilled, hasn't been prepared for growth. Fear is a huge one. I go through that in depth in the presentation from Portland. Most of our parishes operate under the paradigm that the priest is the primary caregiver, and that results in all sorts of things, whether it be burnout or uneven growth, limited engagement. We may have a strong general, but very weak lieutenants. Then there are, of course, three parish paradigms. Not many of us are in the paradigm that I would advocate for, but you'll see up there chapel, daddy, or empowered. And we want to be in empowered ministry models or parish paradigms. Most of us are in chapel, which is characterized by sort of key people running everything, or a daddy model, which has sort of the priest as the center, who's maybe very charismatic, but none of those really lead to the broad base of engagement and leaders who take responsibility like Empower does. There's, of course, the problem of leadership within our communities. Most of us are challenged by that, and we go through in the Portland discussion sort of a progression of character, vision, and competency that leads to trust, and we want to be looking at how we can develop leaders. Then, of course, the last three, many of our parishes lack a strategic plan. We don't even know what it is. We haven't gone through the process. We have lots of meetings, events that aren't aligned with a vision. They don't go anywhere. They're just really tasks, and we become very task-focused as opposed to vision or strategy-focused, and we're not on our vision and mission. And then lastly, there are a whole host of practical obstacles, whether that be the language of our worship, the facility itself, a lack of a welcome committee, you name it, on and on it goes. So that's just a really quick rundown through some of the common obstacles that I think many of us face. We can go to the next slide. You know, when we talk about our parishes and having the ability to reach out and gain new membership, today we had the Feast of the Ascension. Our parish was about 60 people present for the liturgy, but we had about 10 people visiting today on a weekday. And you might say to yourself, is that unusual? It really isn't. I mean, typically in our parish, we'll often see new people coming even in the middle of the week. Well, the characteristics of a healthy parish organization is that I'm not the only person out there who is guiding and leading the parish, but rather we do have trained and empowered leaders. We do have clear expectations, and we're working on this all the time, and we communicate those expectations, and we're moving our leadership to being focused on strategy. All of that has created a healthy paradigm, which naturally unlocks what God already wants, which is our parishes to grow. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, this is really the key point. If you don't get this, then anything I have to say doesn't really make sense. You know, a parish that's always looking for what's standing in its way and what's keeping it from growing is really a healthy and dynamic parish. And Tomaida took issue with my statement from the presentation in Portland. And she said, well, wait a minute, you said that we don't need outreach and evangelism programs. And I said, no, I don't think we do. I think we need to be healthy. So it's not forming a committee on outreach and evangelism. It's rather creating a parish and a paradigm that's healthy. When that occurs, then naturally our parishes reach out and share the gospel. So if you look at it, sort of how we look at the Eucharist, the sick patient needs medicine in order to become healthy. So we want to get the patient healthy. We want to get the parish healthy, and then it will naturally grow and reach out. Next slide. So I think, Tomaida, you want to introduce this section?
Sure. So this next section is just a series of questions that I've kind of collected from people over the last few months, really, and then some that came in as people registered for the webinar. And I just distilled them into different categories, basically, and thought we'd just jump in and start addressing them because people heard Father Evans talk in October and said, okay, that sounds great. Now my next question is, and so we can go to the first one. So let's say you're in a parish that says, okay, Father Evans' talk was amazing. Several of us listened to it or watched on YouTube. Then we decided to start analyzing our parish leadership, and we found a lot of obstacles. What do we do first?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a hard question, because the truth is we may find that in our parish there are, as you mentioned, a number of obstacles, anywhere from lacking a mission statement, not having an organization chart, no strategic planning, low attendance, the list can go on and on. I think one of the things, as I mentioned in the beginning of the process of this webinar, is that, I'm not an expert, but I've attempted to surround myself with people that can help. And so I think one of the things that we can do, if this is a situation we're in, is let's start with a conversation among people in the community that we trust, that we believe have insight. And let's go through a conversation where we identify and prioritize what we think our obstacles are, okay? So I would say the first step is exactly what the slide says. We've got to prioritize. Now, some people might say, well, I think the priority lies in the lack of a strategic plan. Others might say, I think it's in our worship. Others might say it's in our facility. The reality is, in my view, as long as we begin the process of identifying and then removing obstacles, then we're on the right track. I think from experience, I would say, start with something easy. You don't have to go after the oak tree, but maybe find a few saplings. So for example, you may notice that in your parish, you don't have service books. So that's an easy one. Why don't you get service books? Or your service books are dated. Maybe they don't contain all of the music or all of the prayers. Maybe you don't have greeters. You may find that you have maybe a focus on cultural ministries. Maybe your priorities are in dance or in Greek language, and you might say, well, we really don't have a focus on, let's say, religious education. We're not providing anything for our adults. In the end of the day, whether it's your website, whether it's a lack of printed materials, whether it's we don't have greeters, if you start to look for these obstacles, and in the brochure, Tomaida, that you provided the PDF for, is that on the link?
Yeah, I'll show that right here. It is on the link, so those of you who are checking your chat screen.
What I would say is, if you go through that brochure, I kind of break down different areas of ministry, and there's sort of ideas in here and questions. And if you go through them, so let's just take fellowship, number 10. And I list as fellowship, there's a kind of a statement. Fellowship is an important and vital ministry, and it is an extension of the liturgy and part of the priestly office of service and sacrifice. Greet as many people and engage with them socially during fellowship. Have and encourage key people to reach out and speak with visitors. Special instances for fellowship are incredibly important and necessary. So for example, in our parish, we realized one of the obstacles was we had Sunday fellowship, but we didn't have anything going on during the week. And so we decided that at every weekday liturgy, at every Bible study, at every mom's group, whatever it is, there would be a fellowship opportunity that would be connected to the event. And so, you can see from the data this is from 2011, but many of these things sort of apply today. So number 8, website, up-to-date, professional, loaded with resources for parishioners and visitors. I can honestly say, as I peruse websites around the Archdiocese, often the calendar is 6 months behind, very dated photos, links that don't work. Trust me, people are trolling. They often show up in my parish a year, 2 years into their investigation of Orthodoxy. They've been listening to the sermons. They've been streaming our services for 6 months, 7 months, and they show up having already become accustomed to our community through our website. And if your website is dead in the water, you are basically creating a huge obstacle to growth. Toy Maida, any follow-up on these prioritizing question?
Let's see. No, we're good to go. I think that's really helpful. I like the start with the low-hanging fruit concept. So
yeah, it can seem like you've got so many, let's say, obstacles in your way that you can get frozen. And when I talk in the presentation in Portland, that's really a fear response. Fear results in silence or excuses. It results in avoidance or blame, anger. And so what we can do is we can see that there's so many obstacles that we're afraid to make any changes, so we do nothing. And that is incredibly dangerous for our community. So sometimes by starting with something small, we get the ball rolling. So we can go to the next question.
Okay, so the next question is about strategic planning. And one of the challenges that parishes face often is that they start the process and then it kind of drags out because, well, we haven't considered this, or maybe we need to bring this in, or maybe we need to do another poll or a survey or something. And so it can really drag out. So I was just wanted to bring that question. How do we keep strategic planning from going too long? And then are there other challenges that come to your mind about strategic planning that we want to avoid?
Sure. I'm going to start with the last question. And so things that we want to avoid. We want to avoid having our strategic plan become a doorstopper and just simply a white paper. And I would say, that's a challenge for my parish as well. We've got this beautiful strategic plan. We spent a lot of time thinking about it and developing it, but having it be an operative document as opposed to just a white paper, that's, in my view, the hardest challenge. And then I would say refreshing it. You can't sort of place it out there and it becomes static. It constantly has to be reviewed and refreshed. So that's what I would say the greatest challenge. Now, in terms of it going too long, or how do we avoid that? I haven't experienced that, only because in my parish we've done this in depth one time through in the last year and a half. In other organizations I've been involved with, other nonprofits, I've done it as well. In every case, we've used an outside agent of change. What I mean is, don't attempt to do this at home, folks. You need to have somebody who comes in from the outside, who's objective and unbiased, who maybe does this for a living or has a lot of experience in it. I would highly recommend that they're not part of your community. They keep you on task and focused. They're going to set the agenda. They're going to hold you accountable. So if you looked at the Portland presentation, I identify 5 steps to the process. On a really fast track, maybe you can do this in 3 to 6 months. It's probably more like a 6 to 9 month process. But if you use an outside agent of change who sort of is guiding you through the process, I think you can move through it rather quickly. Now, of course, one of the things that we do in the strategic process is we go from really big boulders, down to river rocks, down to pebbles, down to the granular. And in the process, people who are boulder type thinkers and people who are, sands and grain type, they're both mixed in. And what can happen is the one can counteract the other. And if you have a good facilitator from the outside, they'll explain to the people that want to be at the granular level, we're going to get there. And they'll also say to the people that are big boulders, look, we also have to get to the granular level. So that both sides understand that the process involves both. And at any stage, what we want to do is we want to have decision discipline. That's what I saw in the processes that I've been through. Decision discipline means that once we have made a decision and reached consensus, the group agrees to have discipline about the decision. Now, of course, you're going to vet your ideas as you go through the process, and you might get feedback that creates, let's say, a loop to go back, and that's okay. But, what we're not attempting to do is wordsmith every single idea, which is the granular level. And we're also not attempting to ignore, let's say, our specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time-bound goals. In other words, we don't want to just remain in the boulders. Look, we just want to grow the church. Mm-hmm. Well, that doesn't have enough meat to it. So I think with those two things in mind, both avoiding, as you said in the beginning, the eventual pitfalls of it just becoming a piece of paper, a doorstopper, and not renewing it, and then sort of having a process and an outside agent of change, I think you can move through the strategic process, planning process quite efficiently.
Okay. So you would recommend about a year or a year and a half?
I don't think a year and a half. I think, like I said, you can do it, depends on the group. You can do it in 3 to 6 months, maybe 6 to 9 months. Okay. One of the things, and this is a concept that I didn't develop, but comes from the concept of good to great, is, who's on the bus when we're doing this process? So if you think about it for a moment, if you have a bus, you got a driver, you got someone who opens the door of the bus, you have different seats. Who's on the bus and where are they seated? So when you go through a strategic planning process, the leadership in the community has to think carefully about who's guiding the process. So maybe you've got the wrong group and the wrong people. Maybe you got all people who are granular level people. You got no big rock thinkers, or vice versa. So you kind of have the right people seated in the right places on the bus. So you've got to do a little pre-planning with your strategic planning process. One of the key issues that I've learned is that a lot of our failures in the parish result in not thinking carefully prior to setting up our committees. We sort of go with the warm body theory. And we also are afraid to ask people, and I talk about this in the leadership component of my talk in Oregon, and I'm guilty of this too. We're afraid of asking people who are obstacles or people who have taken over and made something about themselves, or they're kind of operating on that chapel model or that daddy model. We're afraid to ask them to step down. When we do that, in other words, when we have one strong general and poor lieutenants, well, what it does is it flattens our results, it decreases our creativity and our engagement. And so it takes courage to step forward and say, we've got the wrong people on the team. Or it takes good pre-planning to say, let's put a filter on who we let on to the strategic planning committee. Let's make sure we have the right people in place, not just anyone.
Okay, great. So we have a couple questions about that. The first one is, how do you differentiate, or are you differentiating between strategic planning and ONCD initiatives? For those who aren't familiar, ONCD stands for Orthodox Natural Church Development, and I can put a link to their website there so you can learn more about that. But Father Evan, are you differentiating between the two?
I am to a degree, but I don't think that they work at opposite purposes. Our parish has gone through the ONCD process. The ONCD process doesn't really get you a strategic plan, but it does identify the strengths and weaknesses. So it's a component. If you look at a strategic plan, it's about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. ONCD does a really good job of identifying those. And then we'll begin, if you will, the long-range strategic goals or maybe SMART goals. But it's not a comprehensive process in that manner. I'm not discounting it at all. I think everybody should try and go through the ONCD process. It's very helpful, but they're different animals. They can work and they do work together.
Okay, great. And then the other question, where do we find a resource for strategic planning? Someone asked, I would imagine it's not your typical business consultant, but someone with an Orthodox faith-based background. And then another person responded that it doesn't necessarily have to be. So what's your take, and do you have any recommendations?
St. Basil had a great parable about the honeybee going around and gathering nectar and bringing it back to the hive. I'm not afraid at all of finding someone who's business-minded. We used someone outside of our parish. She was a Christian, not Orthodox, and they were excellent. So that's not something I think we need to be afraid of. If you go back to my talk in Portland, I make a strong point. The salvific truths of the Orthodox Church are inviolate and indelible. We don't have a problem with theology. We don't have a problem with worship, sacraments, exegesis, theology. Our problem often lies in the O-ring concept. When the space shuttle made it to space and blew up, the Challenger disaster, it was that little plastic gasket. And so, yes, these are business concepts, but they're not antithetical to who we are as Orthodox Christians. What they do is they unlock. Christ, if you really look carefully at the ministry of Christ, he did most of these things, but he did them organically, intuitively. So it doesn't have to be a construct per se. So where do you go find these resources? You probably have people in your community that have gone through this in their places of business. They may have contacts and friends. If you've got a local business college, you can connect with them. Specific organizations like fire departments, police departments, other corporations, they'll have a whole list of resources and maybe even trainers. So a simple internet search in your local area will probably garner a whole bunch of resources in this area.
Okay, great. And I know we want to kind of keep moving, but we did have another question. It's, do you feel that it is necessary for each parish, to establish a mission and vision, or should there be one mission and vision for the church, and I think that's the capital C church,
Yeah.
that all parishes utilize?
It's a good question. And the obvious answer is, of course, there's one vision and mission set out by Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Often people say it's, the Great Commission in Matthew 28:16. There are other versions of it within the tradition of our church. That's very true. But every parish is a local expression of the one body of Jesus Christ. So for our community, it was important that our vision statement came out in the way that it did, an Orthodox community wherein people find transformation in Jesus Christ. Those key words and key concepts are things that we have, if you will, fostered. They're concepts we believe in, words like Orthodox, community, transformation. And then for us, the mission of education, worship, service, community, that's how we accomplish our vision. Those are particular to us. And I think it's important. It's important for you as a community, because communities are different and you serve different populations. And I think that's a mistake to think that we're monolithic. If you go to Armatas, you go to different monasteries, they each have a different feel. And that's okay. But they do represent the same faith. So I think both are necessary.
Okay, great. So the next question is about the organizational chart. What does a parish organizational chart look like? And the next 4 slides are actually sample org charts from your parish. Right. Would you like me to?
Sure, you can go to the first one. I mean, an org chart is, again, it's going to be like a thumbprint. Maybe the top half of yours will look just like ours, because almost all the parishes in our metropolis, whether you're at St. John in Euless, Texas, or St. Spyridon's in Loveland, Colorado, obviously you're going to have the metropolitan and the assigned priest at the top of that organizational chart, with the parish assembly off to the side. What the goal here with your organizational chart is to create clear structure for the members of the community. So they know who is overseeing them, they know where to go when a conflict arises. And also we want to keep people in a structure that's manageable. One of the things that the chapel and the daddy models do is they lay up a lot of responsibilities upon one person. And I mentioned in my talk in Portland, that can be great. Maybe you've got a really dynamic, hardworking priest who's going to work 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and he can keep a lot of things in the air at once. But maybe the next priest can't. And so many of our parishes experience a very uneven growth model or uneven performance. But worse than that is, I think that it ignores the place of the body, the people, the laos. So if you look at this, what we do is you see the priest there, and I really have 4 areas that I oversee: the parish council, the pastoral assistant, which in our parish is not currently filled, the pastoral assistants. We don't have a second priest, but we do have a deacon. And then other non-pastoral staff, and there's some examples there of the youth director and the church school director. If you go down a slide on the org chart, you'll see that we further broke down the responsibilities of those areas. So for the parish council, you'll see that the president has, it's conciliar in nature, but we do have reporting lines. And those are the members of the parish council. The goal is to have no more than 4 to 7, no less than 4, no more than 7 areas of oversight. So if you go to the next level, you'll see, stay there with the red. You'll see that within each of those offices, there is another area of responsibility, or 2 or 3, okay? And then if we go down another slide, you'll see that under the pastoral assistant, an unfilled position at this time in our parish, we break down the 4 areas of ministry which feed into our vision. So there's worship, service, education, community. Each of those ministry groups has a leader and co-leaders, and they'll have their own breakdown once it goes in. So I'll take, for example, let's say all the way over on community, if you go down to youth groups, you'll see that youth groups have several: infant, lap, hope, joy, junior, senior. So there'll be a key leader over youth groups, then there'll be leaders over each of those groups. They might have assistants. So you're constantly creating a clear reporting structure, responsibilities, roles, so that people know where they fit. And then if someone comes into the parish and they're a gate crasher, you can be very clear about, you don't need to talk to me. If you're interested in, increasing readership in our parish, you need to go under education and speak to the person that's in charge of the library. And if that librarian says, well, gosh, I need to push this up, they know they go to the pastoral assistant. If the pastoral assistant's unsure, then they come to the priest. What many of our parishes do is they don't have this clear organizational chart in place. We didn't, because we started as a small parish, so that was very much chapel. We went to daddy, we're becoming empowered. And it creates confusion, it creates resentment, it creates burnout. There are all sorts of unintended consequences when you don't have a clear organizational chart set up.
Yeah, and I just want to say I really like this because I feel like it ties in really well to your mission statement, because your mission statement is so brief and everybody at St. Spyridon can say it. And so maybe you could share that with us, because then I feel like as if I was a leader of one of these ministries and I'm preparing for our next meeting or our next event, I'm always able to easily go back to the why. How does this fit with what we're trying to do as a parish?
Yeah. So, not a concept that I've come up with at all. You want alignment. And so you want all the oars in the water pulling in the same direction, and you want them in cadence. So it's exactly what you said. If everybody knows our vision is an Orthodox community where people find transformation in Jesus Christ, and we do that through worship, service, education, community, then whether you are guest bred or whether you are pan-Orthodox outreach or whether you are the liturgical readers, that's the vision of your ministry. And what you're doing needs to feed into it. When we are without a vision and without clear mission statements, then what happens is we get out of sync. And so fellowship may be pulling in one direction and OCF in another. And we get, again, an uneven performance. We don't know where we're going. And trust me, it's hard enough to integrate into an Orthodox parish theologically. And then if you find that organizationally, we're also kind of a soup sandwich, it can be a very difficult thing. Not only that, parishioners need to be focused, right? So that they know, how is it that I can help the organization? Where do I fit?
Perfect. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move to the next question. So leadership training, and this is something you talk about in the YouTube presentation, and that every single ministry leader at St. Spyridon goes through leadership training. So we'd love to know how you do that, who teaches it.
Sure. So this is a new concept for us, and it's something that we instituted it'll be a year and a half ago. It started with ONCD, and what we noticed, one of our low areas was in the leadership category. We scored above the average, but it was for us a low point score. So we wanted to see how we could change that, move the needle. So we did have a complete leadership training program that we offered to every ministry leader in our parish. It gathered on evenings and on Saturdays. In addition to that, I've become a student under a gentleman here in our community of leadership training. By extension, I've taken what I'm learning and I'm applying it to each of the leaders that I am involved in. We're also actively training our parish council. So we've gone through a whole process of retooling and retraining our parish council as parish leaders. So when you say, how do you conduct it? Who teaches it? Even the strategic process that I mentioned earlier, planning process is a process that teaches leadership. The curriculum, I gave you a document that I think you can share with everybody.
Yes.
Right?
In the handout, it's called Leading and Managing for Results, and it's 2 pages.
And that has come from a gentleman by the name of Chris Christopher, who is a Hewlett-Packard executive. Offerings for our own parish council have been ongoing. For myself as a parish leader, it's been monthly. I've been meeting on a monthly basis. And then for our parish leaders, like I said, it was a year-long course.
Awesome. So a year-long course in addition to leading the ministry.
Yes.
So
yes.
that means you're not going with the warm body approach.
We're attempting to not go with the warm body approach, but I'll give you an example of how that pays off. So, I shared this in Portland. I think it was about 2 months ago in the bulletin. I don't do the bulletin. I don't review the bulletin. I don't have anything to do with the bulletin. I've given directives for the bulletin. And so I opened up the Sunday bulletin, as most priests do on a Sunday morning, to mark what I wanted to highlight. And I noticed the creation of two new ministries that I had no idea about.
Wow.
And so I made the announcement about them. Now, when I say I didn't know anything about them, I'm fibbing a bit. I had met with these leaders about the concept, and being in charge myself in the organizational chart of those parish ministries had approved the concept. But I didn't need to get into the tasks of when they're going to start meeting, how often they're going to meet, what they're going to do. And people took initiative. Or for example, this liturgy this morning, when I showed up at the church, the charcoal was lit. Someone was here getting the candles going. The icon of the Ascension was out. In other words, when we train leaders, when we open up the idea to empowering them, they take ownership and they get engaged. Now, that might be scary, because if we're a daddy model or a chaplain model, wait a minute, we don't have direct control now? Well, you do if you look at your organizational chart. So if something gets awry, right, I have the ability as in an oversight position to sit down with them and retool them, especially when I have a vision statement. But I think we have to get over the idea of trying to control and manage everything from a single point of contact. And we've got to open this up. So when we lead leaders, when we train them, when we empower them, then they'll do what leaders do, and that is they'll develop ministry and they'll engage new people.
Okay, so we do have a couple questions. From Father Constantine, going back to the organizational chart, he asks, can you talk about how you started the parish to make an organizational chart and then accept it?
Well, one of the things that you want to do is, like I said earlier, you want to decide who's on the bus and where are they seated. So, you don't have this discussion with 50 people. We chose to use the parish council because we felt we had the right people on the bus, and we added a couple of key personnel, people from our parish. We went through several iterations. There's a process by which you identify. It's called SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And it's iterative. You're going to go through versions and versions. You're going to refine, but you're going to get to a point where you're going to say, okay, enough, we're close. And then you're going to sit on it. You're going to let it distill and bubble in your hearts. And then you're going to come back to it and you're going to tweak it. And then eventually you vet it. So when we were done, we took it and we called in a larger group of key personnel in our parish and leaders. And we said, all right, look at this, because each mission statement has a sub-statement. We said, does this sound right? And then we got comments. And we went back and we didn't accept all of them. We felt some of the comments weren't productive, and we felt others were were clarifying. And so we said, well, let's edit the document. And then it's a living and breathing thing. So I mentioned in the bottom of my presentation or slide on strategic planning, your plan doesn't last more than 3 to 5 years. So you're going to come back to it. And even while you're in it, we found in our parish council that we keep referring back to this document and going, hey, when we were planning this, that didn't quite, now that we're doing it, make sense. We need to make a course correction.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then another question, which I think we're going to kind of get to, but it's worth bringing up now. How do you convince parish leaders who have been leaders for years and years that they need training? it's difficult enough to convince them that they need the annual seminar to be able to run for office.
Yeah. Well, this is where, as the priest in the parish, I have to have bought into the concept myself. I think it starts with them seeing you go through the process. I think one of my proudest moments was when I was at a clergy assembly just for clergy, and I was speaking to a very senior priest in my parish, and he knows that we were going through this, and my deacon was with me, and he said, is it working, this whole process that you put your parish through? And Deacon Mark turned to this priest who's senior, whom I admire, and he said, Father, let's call him Frank, Father Frank, I've seen Father Evan change over the last year and a half, 2 years.
Wow.
And so I think when our parish sees us change and sees the process reap fruit, they're more likely, we can't call someone to something we're not willing to do. So I think priests, parish council presidents, and other key members of the community, they have to go through the process before we start to ask other people to. But once we've gone through the process, we have a position. Notice that when we preach, the cross is behind us. We preach from the foot of the cross. So we preach from the foot of this organizational change. Now, that being in place, one of the key elements of leadership is courage. And if we are unwilling to make the difficult decision to ask someone who's unwilling to step down, then we lack courage. And when we lack courage, trust me, the body notices. And then people who really would get involved or want to see the church move forward realize it isn't going to happen. They don't have the courage to do it. They step back. Now, I've been guilty of that. You're afraid. This person's been doing this for years. No one else has stepped forward. If I ask them to step down, we're going to have this big giant black hole. Well, every leadership training that I've been to and read, a book I've read has said that is exactly the wrong attitude. That when we have the courage to ask that person to step away because they're unwilling, then trust me, the organization grows healthier. So we actually now have a statement that we have everybody sign in our parish council that basically they make a pledge to buy into the process. That's something we implemented this year for our incoming parish council.
Awesome. Okay.
And trust me, we're not there. We're a work in process. Or progress, I should say.
So we're going to keep going. We only have a little over 10 minutes left, but I feel like this is super beneficial. So we'll see where it goes. So task versus strategy. What suggestions can you give to leaders that gravitate toward task rather than strategy? And then also to those working under their leadership.
One of the things that the coach I've been working with constantly is drilled into my head is that the key failure for most leaders is the lack of reflective thinking. We're just on task all the time. We get in the ditch, we dig as hard as we can, we don't even know where it's going. There's so many things to do. And when you've got a long list of things to do, it can seem like a big waste of time to step back and look at the strategy. So what are the suggestions that I have? Well, the first thing is to notice that that's a failure in leadership. If you're always on task and not on strategy, it's just like I gave the example in the talk, then you're kind of like a helicopter that arrives and just takes care of one household in a natural disaster. When we're on strategy, we can touch a lot more within our parish, and we can, if you will, multiply efforts. So you've got to be on strategy, and then you've got to help or on vision. You've got to help your people that are working with you, the other leaders, do the same. And you've got to mutually call each other back to strategy. So it's a joke sometimes with my parish council president. We'll say, well, that's a task-focused item, or I see myself getting task-focused. But reflective thinking and having time for that seems to be what my coach has told me is the key issue. You've got to take time before meetings. You got to take time before your day to think, what's going on? How do I want to move through this?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're going to keep moving. This is the no one wants the job question.
Mm-hmm.
The core group does everything. We're getting burnout and can't find new people to take on leadership roles. How do we encourage wider participation?
Everything we're talking about. This isn't a single string, we pull this and then that problem goes away. It's all that we're talking about. A healthy parish naturally leads to people stepping forward. So we've got to have the courage to go through the process. And by going through the process, as long as you find in the ONCD process, you're not in the death spiral, there's hope, you know. And so it's a constant refreshing, and it can be scary, and we can be afraid. But everything that we're talking about is what leads to new and wider participation.
Okay, great. Next question. And we did address this actually when you were talking about having the courage to remove somebody from the job. But the question is, we have a leader who continually demonstrates lack of competence and yet won't let go of their position and keeps volunteering for new roles. How do we support this person in developing their talents while protecting our ministries from ruin?
If you're not willing to make that difficult decision, then you're going to see a decrease in participation and health. So you've got to look at the wider picture here. You know, competency is only one component of leadership. So is vision, and so is character. All of those together lead to trust. And so if you're lacking in competency, you just can't allow for it. We really aren't in a place where we can say, we're getting by. So you simply have to retool, retrain, or ask them to step down. But you are changing the tires on a moving bus here, so that makes the task even more difficult. So maybe that person's in an integrated role, and so you've got to retrain them as they're going. But you can't ignore the problem, and that's what I think we want to do in our fear. We just want to ignore it, you know.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So the next question is about young adults, and this is something I've run across a lot in conversation with clergy and lay leaders around the Metropolis, and also there's a new project at Hellenic College Holy Cross called the Telos Project that's about young adults in integrating into parishes. And one of the questions that they're really exploring is, how do you engage young adults and develop them as leaders? And how do you meet the needs of young adults in a parish?
You know, I'm in a unique situation. My parish, probably its largest demographic is young adults. So, 10 years in this parish, I've had a handful of funerals and like 180 baptisms.
Wow.
The majority of those baptisms have been young adults. So my young adult ministry is one of the largest ministries. On a given Sunday, or even today at the feast day, the average age was under the age of 35. And so I've got a lot of young adults engaged in ministry. And again, I hate to sound so stupid and simplistic, but there are hordes of young adults roaming around your community, whether in it or outside of it, who want to be part of the church. And we've simply erected so many barriers that they're not going to come in. The minute we take them down, they show up. We don't have an advertising program. It's not like I heard an incredible TED Talk the other day, and it said, how did Uber become Uber? And it wasn't through putting together this strategic plan to grow and advertise. Someone was sitting on a street corner with their phone and had the Uber app and said to their young friend, look at this, press the button, and a cab showed up. And then they went, wow, that's cool. The minute we take down the barriers and obstacles that are in our parishes, and a young person shows up and starts to get involved, they're going to tell their other friend who's under the age of 40 about this parish and this place. Mm-hmm. And so it creates this linkage. And that's really how, marketers talk about this all the time now, that, general large marketing strategies don't work, but it's through relationships and one-on-one contact. So if you create an environment that's healthy, young adults are attracted to, they're going to tell their friends, and then they're going to show up, and then they're going to want to get involved. And your problem, it's my problem, is you're going to have to figure out how to manage the intensity of their desire. And the integration, that's my biggest problem, is I can't figure out how to integrate them fast enough. And so that's something I'm learning right now. So I now have on my list with my coach, I gotta start studying this idea of integration and how do I ramp someone into a full member of the parish.
Wow. Great problem to have.
Yeah, it's all of our problems if we, again, remove the obstacles.
Yes. Okay, so the next questions are kind of specific to specific transition issues. This is the build or the move, like a parish that's in the midst of a building project.
Like us.
Yes, like you, so you can speak to this well. What leadership priorities do you recommend for parishes that are involved in an all-encompassing building project or moving to a new site?
Well, I think within the question is the problem, all-encompassing.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'd ask the question, why did it become all-encompassing? We lose sight of the vision. The vision is not the building. We all know that. Intuitively, we know that. My parish for 10 years has been constantly involved in building and moving. Because we started with 6 families, rented warehouse, little small chapel, our first property, now a 16,000 square foot facility. Now we're going to renovate it. So it's constantly on the table in this parish, but it's not all encompassing. But I think, in terms of priorities, you've got to stay on vision, not on task. And the vision of the parish is not the building project. It's not moving. So as long as that's clear, and you need to have a strong group of leadership in that area, but it doesn't need to take over. It is a challenge. I'm not going to lie to you. It's very hard to do bricks and mortar and ministry at the same time, but it's not impossible. You can't have your head totally turned towards your building project.
Great. Okay. The next one is about clergy transition. What recommendations can you offer to empowered leadership preparing for or in the midst of a clergy transition? So, best case scenario, you've got empowered leadership, clear, vision, a great org chart, everybody's competent and has trust. But now, the person on strategy, the leader of the parish, is moving and a new person's coming in. What do you recommend to the leadership?
Well, I think every parish has to know it's coming. I mean, from the get-go, every parish should realize the priest they have is not the priest they will have. And every leader in the parish must realize that I'm a leader right now, but I won't be a leader in a year. And so we're constantly in a process of creating transcending structures. This is a term that we put in ourselves to our discussions about building transcending structures. And what does that mean? It means that we build an organization that can transcend generational change, leadership change, that the organization itself is healthy in such a way that when there is a transition from one priest to another, from one parish council president to another, there isn't a drop-off. And again, when we are outside of the chapel or daddy model, this is possible. It is not possible when we are in the chapel or the daddy model. And so, some of us are screaming off a launch pad, but we're completely in the daddy model. And we might say, that's fine with us. But the problem is that you will get uneven performance. Now, I'm not saying if you're empowered and if you've built the transcendent structure, you're immune, but your chances are better. And so if you look at what Christ did, that's exactly what he did. He built a transcending structure. And so that's more important. So the team is more important than the individual. And the general has to view his lieutenants as vital. So they say that in World War II, one of the reasons why the U.S. Army did so well was that there was a transcending structure, and the sergeant and the corporal and the private understood the vision and the mission and the tasks assigned. And so when the captain or the lieutenant or second lieutenant got killed in action, the next person took up the mission. And so that's what we have to have in our parishes as well.
Okay, that's really helpful. So we are at the 1 o'clock mark, so I know some people may need to go, but if Father Evan, if you have a few more minutes, can we do a couple more questions?
Yeah, we could probably take 5 more minutes. Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good. So I'm leaving the book list up here of a couple books that Father Evan mentioned and recommends. Good to Great by Jim Collins, Courage by Gus Lee, and The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. And then I'm going to read a couple questions that came in through the chat. One of them was from Shane asking, how do we develop better followers in addition to leaders? So I know this is a leadership webinar, but his question about followers is a good one.
Well, good followers, come from having good leaders. We can't expect to have good followers if our leadership isn't competent, on vision, and has character. They're not going to trust us. So when we find that people, are in an organization, they say, boy, everybody in here is a goat. We can't seem to get anybody to go the direction we want them to go. I think it's good for leaders to point to themselves and say that's because our leadership is lacking. We have challenges in our parish, like every parish. One of them was brought to my attention yesterday. So I had a sit down with my president, vice president, and myself about an issue that we're struggling over. And the particular person who identified the problem was our VP. He described it. He had brought notes about what he saw as a problem, gave a very good presentation. And then he turned to me and said, what do you think, Father Evan? I said, I think it's a failure in leadership on my part. And I think it's a failure of leadership on our parish council's part. Till we fix that, the people underneath this ministry who are following or needing to be led, it's not going to go anywhere. So we've got to provide leadership. So good followers come when there are good leaders.
Okay, thank you. Another person asked, what are your metrics for health? Are these understood across the parish council?
Well, Father Jonathan Ivanhoff says in the ONCD process that there are 2 trailing metrics for health. And those metrics he identifies are attendance, who's in the pews on Sunday, and dollars. And those metrics, I like the fact that he calls them trailing metrics. We may want to use other metrics like engagement. So for example, if we hold a Bible study, do we regularly see robust attendance? In the end of the day, the level of engagement and transformation, a priest is going to have a different metric than a bookkeeper. But that's not to say one of them is not more important than the other. For me, the transformation of a person into a follower of Jesus Christ is by far the greatest metric. But at the same time, if there's only 2 people in the pews, then maybe I should be paying attention to that other metric as well. So I think, what metrics do we use? We might want to develop a few. I think in our parish and in our parish council, I think there's the general understanding, and this is something I'm going to go back and ask them because I haven't really thought about that with them. What are the metrics they're using? I would tend to say that they probably use attendance and dollars, which is what Father Jonathan pointed out.
Great. So we're going to have one more question that's already been typed into the chat. I want to thank everybody for coming, and if you have to go, we understand. And thank you, Father Evan, for your time. I really appreciate that this has been super helpful. So Vespina asks, she says that she's from a parish has an aging community with a large majority of the congregation over 65, using ethnic language, and non-existent young adults. Very few families with young children. There's concern in the parish about lack of money. So what do we do?
Well, in a sense, everything we've been talking about is, again, what they need to do. I'm gonna touch a third rail and a sacred cow. Why not? I think many of our parishes are ethnically focused, and there's a huge barrier. It's hard for us to understand. I'm of Greek descent. My whole family's Greek, immigrant family. Love my heritage, love my Greek Orthodox background. But if we drive by a church that's got a sign outside that says Korean Presbyterian Church, would you go in? And we'll say, well, it's different. You know, the idea of being Greek is different. It's universal. Hellenism is a universal ideal. But the reality is it's not for anybody outside of the Greek population. So a lot of our parishes that are older and established, not only do they have many of the strategic challenges that I've mentioned, but they also have the ethnic challenges that they're very ethnically focused. Their worship, they'll say, well, it's half in English, but all the hymns are in Greek. So it's really 75% in Greek. They've got a chanter that maybe isn't really pleasing to the ear, and nobody's willing to ask him to step down. You know, you cannot attract new worshipers. You know, Sunday's your biggest day. You come in, if the music's bad, it's in a language you don't understand, it's disorganized and disordered. Trust me, the millennial will not come back. They're not even going to be attracted to it. But when it's spirit-filled, when it's engaging, when they can participate, when they have the resources to understand the worship of the church, they'll show up. And they'll show up, like I said, it was about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I had 8 visitors on Holy Ascension to St. Spyridon's.
Wow.
Okay, on a Thursday in the morning. So I didn't do that. God did it. But we got out of God's way. The Holy Spirit will lead people to church. But if there's not an opportunity to be engaged, then he's going to lead them somewhere else. And I do think that in parishes like the one she's describing, you know, they have to ask that hard question. You know, people will not cross a cultural boundary. You know, they'll say, I can't become Greek. I can't become Russian. I can't become Serbian. Become Christian. Are we willing to touch that third rail and say, maybe our ethnicity, maybe our focus, maybe our worship style has to change? And I realize that's a very loaded and difficult issue. And that we should be rightfully proud of it, that we are Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox or Romanian Orthodox. But that's unintelligible to the person outside your parish. Don't know if I'm completely answering the question, but I felt it needed to be said.
Yes, I think there's a lot of complexity to that question, and you know, to that parish, and I feel you know, a lot of the things that you talked about here can be helpful. You know, just looking for the low-hanging fruit there, and that may be one of the parts of that is the question of ethnicity.
Well, yeah, thank you, Tomaida, for putting this together. I'm going to put in the type box a couple of other resources that people might find beneficial to their parish ministries. So I'll put those out there as well on the chat box.
Great. And I will make those available for those of you that are watching on YouTube in the future. I'll make them available underneath the YouTube video. So thank you so much, Father Evan. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Really appreciate your questions. They make the webinar so much better to have your involvement and your questions that are coming from your parishes and your love for the church. So thank you so much and have a beautiful feast day. We
Thank you.
hope to see you at the next webinar.